The 1894 landscape was dominated by arid expanses, punctuated by rock formations and resilient scrub vegetation. The region had experienced a brief silver mining boom in the previous decade, but most prospectors had already departed, leaving behind abandoned properties and isolated families trying to survive on the unforgiving land. The Brennick farm was located approximately 23 miles north of Winnemucca, accessible only by an irregular trail that became impassable during winter rains. Cornelius Brennick had acquired the property in 1879 for a pittance, shortly after the collapse of a nearby silver mine. His closest neighbors lived nearly 5 miles away, and most barely knew the reserved man who occasionally appeared in town to purchase basic supplies. For 15 years, Cornelius maintained an almost invisible existence. Local merchants described him as a man of few words, always paying in cash, never staying long enough for extended conversations. Some vaguely remembered children accompanying him on sporadic visits to town, but descriptions were inconsistent. Sometimes 2 children were mentioned, other times 3, and ages seemed to vary inexplicably over the years. The spring of 1894 brought a severe drought that transformed vegetation into flammable material. In mid-April, a forest fire began in the eastern mountains and spread rapidly, consuming thousands of acres within days. The county sheriff, along with local volunteers, organized forced evacuations of all rural properties in the predicted path of the flames. It was during this emergency evacuation that Cornelius Brennick's carefully constructed existence began to unravel. What authorities discovered on that isolated property would reveal not just individual crimes, but a systematic pattern of exploitation that had persisted for nearly 2 decades, hidden in plain sight by the vastness of the territory and the indifference of a society that rarely questioned the family arrangements of solitary men on the frontier. This is the disturbing story of the Brennick farm and the 4 children who lived under the absolute control of a man who believed he was saving them, while systematically destroying any possibility they might have normal lives. But the initial discovery would be only the beginning of increasingly dark revelations about what truly happened on that forgotten land. Where are you watching from? Leave your location in the comments. Stories like this happened in isolated corners across the country. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect moment to follow more investigations into the darkest mysteries of American history. Deputy Sheriff Donald Frost arrived at the Brennick property on the morning of April 16, 1894, accompanied by 2 local volunteers. The sky was heavy with smoke, and the smell of burning wood permeated the air even at this distance from the main fire. His mission was simple: locate all residents and escort them to Winnemucca until the danger passed. Evident signs of recent occupation marked the property: smoke rising from the main house chimney, clothes hanging on a makeshift clothesline, agricultural tools organized near a small barn. But there was no response to Frost's initial calls. He knocked on the front door repeatedly, identifying himself loudly, but was met only with silence. After several minutes of waiting, Frost decided to circle the property to check if anyone was working in the fields. That's when he noticed something peculiar: a series of small wooden structures scattered across the terrain, arranged in a strangely organized manner, almost military in their precision. In a distant field, 4 children worked methodically in rows of vegetation. They moved with mechanical efficiency, pulling weeds and organizing tools with precise, repetitive movements. The absolute silence was what disturbed most. No conversation, no noise beyond the sounds necessary for work. Frost's approach provoked an instant reaction. All 4 children froze completely, tools suspended in midair, bodies tense in anticipation. They didn't turn to look at him, didn't respond, simply stopped in strange positions, awaiting something unknown. Frost tried a gentler approach, introducing himself again and explaining about the fire. The oldest child, a fragile-looking girl with dark hair tied carelessly, slowly turned her head. Her eyes had an empty quality that Frost would later describe: not exactly fear, but an absence of expression suggesting profound resignation. Without speaking, she made an almost imperceptible gesture toward the main house, then immediately returned to work. The other three remained motionless throughout the entire exchange, faces turned toward the ground, postures bent suggesting habitual submission. Frost gestured for his companions to stay with the children while he returned to the house. This time, when he knocked on the door, there was a response. A medium-statured man, appearing to be in his early 50s, opened only enough for his face to be visible. Cornelius Brennick had angular features, irregularly cut grey hair, and eyes that assessed Frost with calculated intensity. Frost explained the situation. Cornelius listened in silence, without interrupting, without asking questions about the severity or available time for preparation. When Frost finished, Cornelius simply nodded once and said he would gather his children. His voice was monotone, devoid of emotion or appropriate urgency. Minutes later, the 4 children were already formed in a straight line near the entrance, each carrying a small cloth bag. The formation was militarily precise, equal spacing, identical postures, gazes fixed on the ground. Frost had never seen children behave this way. A brief gesture from Cornelius was enough. Immediately, all 4 began marching toward the wagon, their steps synchronized unnaturally. No conversation, no typical confusion of children being rushed, only silent, mechanical obedience. During the 3-hour journey to Winnemucca, Frost tried several times to initiate conversations. He asked names, ages, if they were afraid of the fire. Each question was met with silence. The children would briefly glance at Cornelius before lowering their eyes, seeking permission that was never granted. Cornelius also remained quiet during most of the trip. When Frost asked basic questions about the property, responses were monosyllabic and technically correct, but devoid of any information beyond the strictly necessary. There was a defensive quality to his silence. Subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. The children had visibly different ages. The oldest clearly in adolescence, the youngest still small. But their clothes were almost identical in style and wear. Even stranger, none resembled Cornelius or each other physically. The oldest girl had dark hair and delicate features. The second was blonde with prominent freckles. The oldest boy had slightly darker skin and different bone structure. The youngest child was red-headed with light eyes. Possible they were half-siblings from different mothers, but something in the uniformity of their behavior suggested a more complex connection. Upon arriving in Winnemucca, Frost directed them to the community hall, serving as temporary shelter. The contrast was immediately visible. Normal children ran, asked questions, complained about discomfort. The Brennick children simply sat in a straight line, where Cornelius indicated, remaining completely motionless. Local women tried to offer food and water. The response was disconcerting. Each child looked at Cornelius, waiting for an almost imperceptible gesture of approval before accepting. Even then, they ate in a controlled manner, without the enthusiasm or gratitude typical of children. Helen Pritchard, a woman with experience as a teacher, tried to converse with the oldest girl. She asked her name, if she attended school, what her favorite activities were. The girl remained completely mute, eyes fixed on an indefinite point ahead. Helen approached Frost discreetly and whispered that something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just shyness or trauma from the fire. It was conditioned behavior she had never seen before, not even in children from orphanages. Frost decided to ask Cornelius discreet questions for evacuation records. Full names, birth dates, mothers' names. Cornelius provided the information without hesitation, but there was something mechanical in his responses. The names were common enough. Ida, Nora, Virgil, Clyde. Declared ages, 16, 13, 10, and 7 years. Each child from a different marriage. All mothers died during or shortly after childbirth. No other living relatives. A perfectly plausible story for the era, when maternal mortality was high and widowed men frequently raised children alone. But the way Cornelius presented this information bothered Frost. No emotion when mentioning the supposedly dead wives, no variation in tone when speaking of different women he supposedly had loved and lost. As the afternoon progressed, the Brennick children's behavior remained consistently abnormal. They didn't interact with other children, didn't explore the space, didn't ask questions. When Cornelius stood up, all four became alert, bodies tense in anticipation. Helen made another attempt, bringing paper and pencil, thinking perhaps they could express themselves through drawing. Ida looked at the materials with fundamental incomprehension. When Helen gently took Ida's hand to guide her in holding the pencil, the reaction was immediate and alarming. The girl violently withdrew her hand, a low guttural sound escaping from her throat. The other three immediately cowered, bodies assuming identical defensive postures. Cornelius quickly stood and positioned himself between Helen and the children. He said nothing threatening, made no aggressive gestures, but his presence was intimidating in a subtle way. Helen instinctively backed away, apologizing. Cornelius simply nodded, and the children immediately relaxed. This incident convinced Frost that deeper investigation was needed. There was a pattern of control and fear that couldn't be explained by simple, rigid discipline. He decided to send a telegram requesting verification of Cornelius Brennick's records. As night fell, evacuated families settled in to sleep. The Brennick children remained seated until Cornelius finally gave permission for them to lie down. Even then, they arranged themselves in precise formation, bodies rigid even in sleep. Frost remained awake for hours, observing the strange family. Questions grew in his mind, about the dead mothers never mentioned in town records, about children who didn't resemble each other or their father, about a pattern of behavior suggesting something far more sinister. 3 days later, the response to Frost's telegram arrived. The content was disturbing in its scarcity. No birth records for any of the 4 Brennick children in Humboldt County. No marriage records for Cornelius in the past 20 years. The only official documents related to him were the property purchase in 1879 and some sporadic commercial transactions. Sheriff Daniel Cartwright had arrived at the shelter to assess the evacuees' situation. Experienced after 15 years in office, he agreed the circumstances warranted more detailed questioning. They approached Cornelius separately, asking him to accompany them for a private conversation. He showed no surprise or resistance, simply stood and followed them. Before leaving, he made a brief gesture. The children immediately assumed even more rigid positions. In the private room, Cartwright began with seemingly innocuous questions about the property. Cornelius responded with the same monotone, providing technical details about farming and maintenance, but avoiding any personal information. When questioned about the children's mothers, he repeated the same story: different marriages, deaths during childbirth, no other relatives. Cartwright casually mentioned the absence of official records. The reaction was subtle but revealing. An almost imperceptible pause, a slight stiffening of posture. Cornelius explained he had married in different localities during his years working in silver mines, that records probably existed but in different counties, that frontier life frequently meant irregular documentation. A plausible explanation, technically possible given the transient nature of mining life, but there was something rehearsed in how he presented these justifications. Frost changed approach, asking about the children's education. Cornelius claimed he taught them at home, that they knew basic reading and writing, that they didn't need formal schooling. When asked if the children had friends or interacted with other families, he responded that isolation was necessary to protect them from corrupting influences. Cartwright pressed further, asking specifically what kind of influences he considered dangerous. The response revealed a disturbing philosophy. Modern society was corrupting traditional values. Children raised in cities became weak and dependent. Hard work from an early age was the only way to develop true character. Nothing technically illegal, but the coldness with which he pronounced the words suggested a rigid ideology that permitted no deviations. The sheriff then asked if he could speak with the children individually. Cornelius's reaction was the first clear demonstration of emotion. Visible tension in his face, clenched fists, a prolonged pause before responding. He argued the children were extremely shy with strangers, that separating them from him would cause unnecessary distress. Cartwright responded firmly that as sheriff, he had authority to verify Mina's well-being. Tension increased considerably. Cornelius finally agreed, but insisted the interviews be brief and that he remain nearby. Cartwright refused the second condition. They began with Ida. Helen Pritchard was invited to participate, thinking a female presence might help. When Ida was led into the room, separated from Cornelius for the first time since evacuation, her entire body trembled. She didn't cry or scream, but her eyes moved constantly between door and windows, searching for escape routes. Helen tried a gentle approach, offering water and asking simple questions. Ida didn't respond verbally, but after several minutes began making minimal gestures, head nods for yes or no. When asked if Cornelius was her father, there was prolonged hesitation before a nod that seemed more automatic than convinced. Cartwright tried more direct questions. Had Cornelius ever hurt her? Ida froze completely, face becoming an empty mask. Was she afraid of him? No response. Would she like to live somewhere else? Ida's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall, blinking rapidly and returning her gaze to the floor. Helen asked permission to examine Ida's hands. The girl extended them mechanically. The palms were covered with thick calluses, developed after years of heavy manual labor. There were also old scars on fingers and wrists. Some appeared to be from cuts or scratches. Others had more regular patterns suggesting marks from bindings. When Helen gently asked about the scars, Ida violently withdrew her hands and hid them. Her body began to rock slightly, a repetitive self-comforting movement. She began emitting low sounds, not words, but guttural vocalizations, suggesting extreme distress. Cartwright ended the interview before Ida entered complete collapse. When the door opened and she saw Cornelius waiting, there was an instant transformation. The panic disappeared, replaced by the empty mask. She walked to him with mechanical steps and assumed position at his side. Interviews with the others followed similar patterns. Nora demonstrated the same fear of separation and inability for verbal communication. Her hands also showed extensive calluses and scars. Virgil was even more withdrawn, cowering whenever anyone approached too closely. Clyde seemed not to fully understand what was happening, but imitated the older one's behavior with disturbing precision. None could provide significant information. They didn't speak about their lives on the farm, about daily routines, about memories of mothers or earlier times. Cartwright convened a meeting with Frost and Helen. Something was clearly deeply wrong, but without concrete proof of severe physical abuse, their legal options were limited. The law of the era gave parents, or supposed parents, almost absolute authority over children. Helen argued vehemently that the children were suffering severe psychological trauma. Frost agreed, mentioning the calluses suggesting forced labor inappropriate for their ages. Cartwright acknowledged the concerns, but knew they needed more concrete proof. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of Winnemucca's merchants mentioned he remembered Cornelius from years earlier, not from Nevada, but from Montana, where he had worked before. He remembered because Cornelius had purchased unusual supplies, large quantities of chains and padlocks, more than would be normal for a rural property. This information led Cartwright to send telegrams to Montana authorities. The response would take several days. Meanwhile, he decided the children shouldn't return to the farm with Cornelius, even after the fire was controlled. He used the justification that the property needed safety inspection before minors could return. Cornelius protested for the first time with genuine emotion. He argued the children needed him, that separating them would cause irreparable harm, that he had rights as a father. Cartwright maintained his position. Tension was palpable, but Cornelius finally backed down, recognizing he had no legal choice. The children were housed in a temporary family home under Helen's supervision. The separation was traumatic. Ida became completely motionless and unresponsive for hours. Nora began hurting herself by banging her head against the wall. Virgil refused to eat, and Clyde cried for the first time since they'd been found. It was evident that, however harmful Cornelius's influence was, they had developed pathological dependence on him. Over the following days, Helen worked patiently to establish some level of trust. Progress was minimal. The children gradually accepted food and water, but remained in constant alert. They slept in formation, woke at the slightest sound, refused to participate in any activity that wasn't physical work. After 5 days of near total silence, Nora whispered a single phrase to Helen. "He knows when we lie." When Helen gently pressed for more information, Nora closed off again. But those 5 words revealed volumes about the type of psychological control exercised. The response from Montana arrived on the morning of the 8th day. There were records of Cornelius Brennick living in Silverbow County between 1872 and 1877. During that period, he had informally adopted 3 children from families in difficulties. All 3 had died before completing 8 years. 2 from respiratory diseases, 1 from injuries described as accidental. More disturbing, there was a report from a local doctor who had treated one of the children shortly before death. The doctor had noted signs of severe malnutrition and multiple fractures in different stages of healing, suggesting repeated trauma over time. He had expressed concerns to local authorities, but no action had been taken before the child died. Cornelius had left Montana shortly after the 3rd child's death, apparently to avoid deeper investigation. He had moved to Nevada and, after a period of silence in records, had begun again, acquiring children through informal arrangements with desperate families, raising them in total isolation. Cartwright now had legal basis for complete investigation. He obtained judicial authorization to thoroughly inspect the Brennick property. A team was organized. Cartwright himself, Frost, 2 additional deputies, and a local doctor to document any physical evidence. They departed for the farm the next morning. The fire had passed without directly hitting the property, leaving it intact but surrounded by charred landscape. As they approached, Frost felt a growing weight of apprehension. What they would discover on that property in the following days would change not only their understanding of the case, but their perceptions of how far human cruelty could extend when hidden from society's view. If you're following this disturbing investigation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. The Brennick farm story is only beginning to reveal its darkest layers. The initial inspection of the main house revealed Spartan conditions. There was basic furniture, adequate food supplies, evidence of recent occupation. But it was the organization that drew attention. Everything arranged with military precision, not a single item out of place. No personal objects, toys, books, or any indication that children lived there. 4 identical small rooms contained only a thin mattress on the floor and a wooden chest each. Inside the chests, identical clothes in different sizes, all made from the same coarse fabric, all in the same functional style without any adornment. Thin blankets that would be insufficient during Nevada's harsh winters. Frost found something disturbing in one of the rooms. Scratch marks on the inner walls of the door, old and deep, suggesting desperate effort over a long time. Examination of the other doors revealed evidence that all had been equipped with external locks at some point, though the mechanisms had been recently removed. The basement was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen. When Cartwright opened it, a nauseating odor rose, a mixture of mold, urine, and something sweeter and putrid. The descending staircase was steep and precarious, steps worn from frequent use. The team's doctor hesitated, covering his nose with a handkerchief before descending. The underground space extended beneath the entire house. 3 distinct areas revealed different aspects of the system Cornelius had built. The first contained tools and agricultural supplies, organized with the same obsessive precision seen above. Among normal items were disturbing objects. Heavy chains fixed to walls at multiple points, shackles of different sizes clearly intended for children's wrists and ankles, and a set of boards with notches suggesting use as restraint devices. The second area was what could only be described as a confinement cell. A natural depression in the dirt floor had been deliberately deepened and expanded. It measured approximately 6 feet long by 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, large enough to contain a person lying down, but not to stand. Heavy boards were stacked beside it. The doctor examined the pit carefully. The earth on the sides showed nail marks, desperate scratches from someone trying to climb the walls. Dark stains on the bottom appeared to be old blood. More disturbing, there were small, irregular holes in the covering boards, not large enough to permit escape or even significant movement, but sufficient to allow minimal air passage. Frost realized the purpose. This wasn't a tomb. It was a temporary prison, designed to keep someone alive, but in conditions of extreme suffering. The depth would prevent the victim from standing. The boards would prevent movement, but the air holes would guarantee prolonged survival. Calculated torture, not execution. The third area contained shelves where Cornelius kept meticulous records. Leather-bound notebooks organized by date, each with annotations in precise handwriting. Cartwright began leafing through the most recent volumes. Cornelius had documented every aspect of the children's lives with obsessive detail. Wake times, assigned tasks, meals provided, punishments administered. But it was the language that revealed his mentality. Children were referred to as subjects or by numbers, not by names. Punishments were described as necessary corrections or behavioral adjustments, always justified by some perceived transgression. A particularly disturbing entry from 3 years earlier described in clinical detail how Subject 1 had been placed in the confinement pit for 72 hours after demonstrating inappropriate, independent thoughts. Cornelius had recorded regular checks to ensure she remained alive, including minimal water provision through an improvised tube. Other entries documented an elaborate system of psychological control. Speaking without permission resulted in food deprivation. Making direct eye contact resulted in confinement in darkness. Demonstrating emotion resulted in additional physical work until complete exhaustion. More revealing were the annotations about the children's origins. Cornelius had meticulously recorded how he had acquired each one, not through legal adoptions, but through transactions with desperate families. He had offered money or supplies in exchange for the children, always choosing situations where it was unlikely anyone would come looking for them later. Ida had been purchased for $50 from a widowed woman in Carson City who was starving and had other children to feed. Nora had been handed over by a widowed father in Virginia City who worked in mines and had no way to care for a baby. Virgil had been taken from a workers' camp after his mother died of typhus. Cornelius had simply offered to care for the baby, and no one had questioned it. Clyde had been obtained from an immigrant family during a severe winter, when they were on the brink of starvation. In each case, Cornelius had chosen carefully. Families without resources, without strong social connections, in situations of desperation where surrendering a child seemed the only option. He had provided false documentation when necessary, invented stories about marriages and deaths. But the records also revealed something even darker. There were references to other children, numbered differently, with annotations that ended abruptly. Subject A, discontinued due to constitutional weakness. Subject B, adaptation failure, removed from program. Subject C, medical complications resulted in premature termination. Cartwright ordered a complete search of the exterior property. The team divided, looking for areas of disturbed earth, suspicious depressions, any sign of previous excavation. One of the deputies found the first grave, located behind the barn in an area partially hidden by vegetation. The earth had settled over the years, but still showed irregular contours. They began digging carefully, and less than 3 feet deep found small bones. The doctor examined the remains with a somber expression. They were from a small child, buried several years ago. Based on size, he estimated they belonged to a very young child, but couldn't determine exact age without specialized knowledge he didn't possess. They continued searching. A second grave approximately 20 yards from the first. This contained remains of a slightly larger child. The burial pattern was identical. Shallow grave, no markers, no indication that a human life had ended there. The search extended throughout the day and into the next. In total, they found evidence of at least 5 burials beyond the 2 initial graves. Some contained only bone fragments, making precise determination difficult. But the pattern was clear. Cornelius had been doing this far longer than anyone had imagined. The records found in the basement were cross-referenced with the discovered graves. The approximate dates of discontinuation in the notebooks corresponded to estimated burial periods. Cornelius had methodically documented not only the abuse of living children, but also the disposal of those who died under his care. More disturbing was the absence of any emotion or remorse in the annotations. Deaths were recorded with the same clinical coldness as daily tasks or weather conditions. One of the final discoveries was a set of small structures Frost had noticed during the initial evacuation. Closer examination revealed they were shelters where children were forced to sleep during warmer months, separated from each other, without adequate protection. The structures were too small to allow them to stand fully upright. Inside one of these structures they found scratches on the inner walls, desperate messages carved into the wood. Most were illegible or incoherent, but some phrases could be distinguished. "Please, someone find us. I want to go home." It hurt so much. The messages were in different hands, suggesting multiple children over the years had tried to leave some record of their suffering. The team spent 3 more days documenting every aspect of the property through detailed written descriptions and careful drawings. Each new discovery added layers to the horror, a punishment system that went beyond physical abuse to include calculated psychological torture, a complete absence of empathy or recognition of his victims' humanity. When they finally returned to Winnemucca with their findings, news spread rapidly. The community was shocked and horrified. Cornelius Brennick had lived among them for 15 years, conducting occasional business, maintaining an appearance of respectability, while systematically torturing children on his isolated property. Cornelius Brennick was formally arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse, forced labor, illegal confinement, and negligent homicide. Held in Winnemucca jail while prosecutors prepared the case, he refused to speak with anyone beyond his appointed attorney during the first weeks. Only when confronted with the totality of evidence, the meticulous records, the discovered graves, the limited testimonies of surviving children, did Cornelius finally begin to speak. But his statements weren't confessions in the traditional sense. They were justifications, explanations of a logic that viewed his actions not as crimes, but as a necessary social project. Cartwright conducted the main interrogations, accompanied by a prosecutor and a clerk, to document every word through detailed written notes. Cornelius spoke with the same monotone as always, showing no emotion or remorse. He described the system he had created, referring to children as subjects and his punishments as necessary methodologies. It began in Montana after his own daughter's death in 1879. The child had died of scarlet fever at 4 years old, and his wife had blamed him for not seeking adequate medical treatment in time. She had left him, saying he was incapable of love or compassion, that something was fundamentally broken in his capacity to connect emotionally with other human beings. Cornelius had internalized these accusations in a perverted way. Instead of recognizing his own emotional deficiencies, he developed a philosophy that viewed emotion and affection as weaknesses that needed to be eliminated. He believed his daughter had died because she was too weak, too pampered, not prepared for life's harsh realities. If he could raise children through rigorous discipline, constant work, and systematic elimination of any trace of emotional weakness, he would be producing superior human beings, capable of surviving any circumstance through pure willpower and physical resistance. The 3 children in Montana had died, but Cornelius didn't see this as system failure. He viewed them as inadequate subjects, constitutionally incapable of achieving the level of resistance he sought to develop. When he left Montana and established himself in Nevada, he had refined his methodology. He would be more selective in choosing subjects, more rigorous in implementing discipline, more careful in maintaining complete isolation. The isolated Humboldt property was perfect, far enough from any neighbor that screams wouldn't be heard, remote enough that unexpected visitors were rare. Cornelius described in cold detail how he had acquired each child over the years. He had a specific pattern. He sought families in situations of extreme desperation, where surrendering a child could be rationalized as necessary for other family members' survival. He offered money or supplies, always emphasizing he would give the child a better life. Once he had a child, the molding process began immediately. Complete isolation from any external influence, rigid routines of work and discipline, systematic punishment of any demonstration of emotion or independent thought. The goal was to completely break the existing personality and rebuild the child according to his principles. The punishment system was elaborate and calculated to cause maximum psychological suffering without necessarily leaving permanent physical marks. Confinement in darkness, food deprivation, prolonged isolation, physical work until complete exhaustion. Each method specifically chosen to teach lessons about obedience and weakness elimination. The confinement pit in the basement was his most effective tool. He used it when a child demonstrated what he called fundamental resistance, escape attempts, questioning of his orders, expression of longing for original families. Being temporarily buried alive, he explained coldly, eliminated any illusion that escape or rescue hope existed. It was a form of psychological death that left the child physically alive but mentally broken. When questioned about the children who had died, Cornelius showed the same lack of emotion. He viewed them as failures, subjects who didn't have the necessary constitution to survive the molding process. Some had died from diseases he refused to treat, believing that overcoming illness without medical intervention was part of strengthening. Others had died from injuries during forced labor or punishments that went too far. In his perverted logic, these were natural results of a selection process. Only the strongest would survive, and those who died simply proved they weren't suitable for his project. He had buried the bodies without ceremony because he saw no value in sentimental rituals. Ida, Nora, Virgil, and Clyde were his successes, children who had survived years of his system and demonstrated the qualities he sought to develop. They were obedient, hard-working, devoid of useless emotions, capable of enduring suffering without complaint. He was genuinely confused about why authorities viewed this as abuse rather than superior education. During these interrogations, Cornelius made an additional revelation that shocked even the hardened investigators. He casually mentioned that his wife, who had left him after their daughter's death, had never really departed. When pressed, he explained with the same coldness that she had asked to die, that she couldn't live with the guilt and pain of loss. Cornelius claimed he had granted her request. He described how he had strangled his wife in 1879, shortly before leaving Montana, and buried the body in a remote mountain area. He had never been questioned about her whereabouts because she had no close family, and they lived isolated. But there was something in how he told this story that suggested perhaps it hadn't been a request. Perhaps his wife had threatened to expose his activities with the adopted children, or perhaps she simply represented an obstacle to his plans. Cornelius never directly admitted he had lied about her supposed request, but prosecutors suspected the murder had been premeditated, not merciful. Montana authorities were contacted, and a search was organized based on the vague descriptions Cornelius provided. Months later, female remains were found in a remote area that corresponded to the general location he had mentioned. Definitive identification was impossible after so much time. But the discovery added another probable victim to the growing number of deaths associated with Cornelius Brennick. During weeks of interrogations, Cornelius never demonstrated genuine remorse. He expressed frustration that his project had been interrupted, irritation at not being understood, but never acknowledgement that he had caused unjustifiable suffering. Cartwright tried various approaches to provoke some recognition of humanity in the victims. He described the children's suffering in detail, mentioned how Ida still had nightmares every night, how Nora hurt herself compulsively, how Virgil couldn't tolerate being touched. Cornelius listened to everything with an empty expression, occasionally making mental notes. Only when Cartwright mentioned the children would be reunited with their original families or placed in adoptive homes did Cornelius show something resembling emotion. He argued vehemently this would be disastrous, that the children weren't prepared for normal environments, that years of his training would be wasted. It wasn't concern for the children's well-being, it was frustration at seeing his project dismantled. The trial was scheduled for autumn 1894. Prosecutors had overwhelming evidence: Cornelius's meticulous records, the remains found on the property, the surviving children's limited testimonies, and his own detailed confessions. But Cornelius never reached trial. 3 weeks before the scheduled date, guards found him dead in his cell. He had used torn strips of bedsheet to create an improvised rope and hanged himself during the night. The suicide had been executed with the same cold efficiency that characterized all his actions. He had left a note, written in his precise handwriting on the back of a legal document. It contained only one line: "They were stronger than my true daughter. I saved them from weakness." It was his final declaration, a last affirmation that he believed he had done something noble. Cornelius's death ended any possibility of public trial or formal justice, but it also brought a type of relief to the surviving children. Ida, when informed, showed no visible emotion, but that night slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. The weeks following Cornelius's death were dedicated to attempting to reconstruct the surviving children's lives and identify all his victims. Helen Pritchard assumed a central role in this process, working tirelessly to establish some sense of normalcy for Ida, Nora, Virgil, and Clyde. Ida, at 16, was the oldest and theoretically closest to being able to live independently. But years of systematic abuse had left deep marks. She had extreme difficulty with simple decisions: what to eat, what to wear, when to sleep. Her entire life had been dictated by Cornelius's orders, and the absence of that rigid structure left her paralyzed by anxiety. Helen worked patiently to help her develop basic autonomy. They began with simple choices: preference between 2 food options, decision about which activity to do. Each small decision was a monumental challenge for Ida, who had been conditioned to believe independent thought would result in severe punishment. Gradually, over months, Ida began speaking in short sentences. Her voice was low and hesitant. She described vague, undefined sensations, not specific visual memories, but emotional impressions she couldn't fully explain. There was something about safety, about gentleness, about a time before constant fear. Based on these fragmented descriptions and records found on the property, investigators managed to trace Ida's original family. The woman who had sold her to Cornelius still lived in Carson City. When contacted, she initially denied any knowledge, but confronted with evidence, finally admitted the transaction she had made 16 years earlier. The woman, now in her early 40s and mother of 4 other children, entered emotional collapse upon learning what had happened to the baby she had surrendered. She explained between sobs that she was starving in 1878, that her husband had died, and she had no way to feed all her children. Cornelius had appeared offering a better life for the child she couldn't sustain. When authorities suggested reuniting Ida with her biological mother, the situation became complicated. The woman expressed profound guilt and desire to meet her daughter, but also fear and uncertainty about how to integrate a traumatized adolescent into her established family. The meeting was devastatingly uncomfortable. Ida looked at the woman who was her biological mother with an empty expression, without recognition or emotional connection. When the woman tried to embrace her, Ida violently recoiled, body assuming the defensive posture developed under Cornelius's abuse. The woman cried and repeatedly asked forgiveness. Ida didn't respond, not because she didn't understand, but because she had no emotional context to process the situation. She had spent 16 years being conditioned to suppress emotions, to view human connections as dangerous weaknesses. After several failed attempts to establish some connection, it became clear reunification wasn't viable. Ida's biological mother didn't have the emotional or financial resources to deal with a severely traumatized adolescent's complex needs. Ida was eventually placed in a Reno orphanage. Nora, at 13, presented different challenges. Investigators traced her origin to Virginia City, where her father had handed her over to Cornelius when she was only months old. The man had died of cirrhosis in 1889. Without family reunification options, Nora also needed placement in an adoptive or institutional home. But her behavior made this extremely difficult. She had developed self-harm habits, banging her head against walls, scratching her arms until they bled, refusing food for days at a time. Years of severe punishments for minimal infractions had created a compulsive need to punish herself before others could. A Reno family, experienced in caring for children with special needs, agreed to try adopting Nora. The first months were extremely difficult. Nora repeatedly fled, always trying to return toward Humboldt. Each time she was found and brought back, she became completely motionless for days. Virgil, at 10, was perhaps the most withdrawn of all. He rarely made eye contact, didn't respond to direct questions, spent hours in static positions. Investigators never managed to definitively trace his original family. Records from the workers' camp where his mother had died were non-existent. Without known family, Virgil was placed with a farming family who had lost a son in an accident years before. But Virgil never managed to fully relax, always maintaining emotional distance. He learned to perform tasks when instructed, to follow established routines, but never developed his own initiative or capacity to express needs and desires. Clyde, at 7, was the youngest and theoretically had the best chance of recovery. Investigators managed to locate his original family, Irish immigrants who had surrendered the baby during the brutal winter of 1887. The family still lived in Nevada, in conditions only marginally better. Clyde's biological parents expressed desperate desire to recover their son. They had carried guilt and pain for 7 years, always wondering about the fate of the child they had surrendered. When they learned what had happened, they were devastated and determined to bring Clyde back. But reunification was traumatic. Clyde didn't remember his original family. He was only months old when taken. The only parental figures he knew were Cornelius and, to a lesser extent, the older siblings. These strangers claiming to be his parents were terrifying. The family tried for months to establish connection. They were gentle, patient, desperate to compensate for lost years. But Clyde didn't understand gentleness. He had been conditioned to expect punishment for any behavior. When his biological parents tried to embrace him or demonstrate affection, he froze or tried to flee. Eventually, with Helen's help and others, the family developed a more gradual approach. They learned to respect Clyde's boundaries, not to force physical contact, to let him process emotions at his own pace. Progress was measured in tiny increments: a moment of eye contact, a whispered word, a night without nightmares. While the 4 surviving children struggled to build some semblance of normal life, investigators continued working to identify all of Cornelius's victims. The remains found on the property were examined by doctors, but definitive identification was impossible in most cases. Messages were sent to authorities in multiple states, describing the general circumstances of unidentified victims. Some families responded, desperate for any information about children who had disappeared years earlier. But in most cases, there was never certainty, only suppositions based on vague chronologies. What became clear through investigation was that Cornelius had operated his abuse system for nearly 2 decades, moving between Montana and Nevada, always seeking vulnerable families, always finding children no one would search for very intensely. He had exploited gaps in child protection systems, the vastness of Western territory, and the desperation of families in impossible situations. One mystery remained without complete solution: the federal censuses of 1880 and 1890. Records showed he had provided information during both censuses, but the numbers and ages of declared children didn't correspond to reality. Apparently, he had falsified data or simply hidden some children during census takers' visits. She continued working with the Brennick children for years after Cornelius's death, documenting their progress and setbacks, their struggles to develop basic social skills. But she also recognized the severe limitations of what could be done. 1894. Medicine and psychology didn't have adequate tools to treat complex trauma. The Brennick property was sold by the county in 1896 for minimal value. New owners completely demolished all existing structures, filled the basement with earth, and built a new house in a different location on the terrain. But rumors persisted for decades about the cursed land, and the property changed hands multiple times. The graves where unidentified victims had been found were marked with simple small stones. No names, only approximate dates, and the inscription, "Unknown Child." It was an inadequate memorial for lives that had been stolen and discarded. Ida remained in the orphanage until completing 18 years. She learned basic sewing and domestic work skills, eventually obtaining employment as a helper in a local family home. She never married, never developed close friendships, but managed to maintain basic independent existence. She died in 1951, at 57, having lived a life of silent isolation that echoed her childhood years. Nora struggled throughout her life with self-destructive behaviors. She spent periods in institutions when her self-harm episodes became too severe. Eventually, she found some stability working as a seamstress, an occupation that allowed isolation. She died in 1956 at 58. Virgil lived with the farming family until adulthood, then worked as a helper in a local sawmill. He was known for his reliability and hard work, but also for his inability to tolerate routine changes or physical proximity. He never married and maintained few social contacts. He died in 1960 at 62. Clyde had what could be considered the most positive outcome, though still deeply marked by trauma. He eventually developed some level of connection with his biological family, though never completely comfortable. He married at 32 and had a daughter, though the marriage was marked by emotional distance and severe intimacy difficulties he never managed to fully overcome. He died in 1963 at 64. Before dying, Clyde left a small wooden box with his daughter. Inside were objects he had kept for decades, small figures carved in wood, stones painted with natural pigments, and a notebook with primitive drawings. The images showed figures in work positions, underground structures, and scenes his daughter couldn't fully interpret. On one of the last pages of the notebook, there was an almost illegible inscription, written with a trembling hand, "For those who remained in the dark." It was a vague, enigmatic reference, perhaps to the siblings who had shared his suffering,